Okay, it's with great pleasure that we welcome Roddy Slorach to give this Engage at Liverpool talk tonight. He's going to be talking about his work, and I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. Roddy's written widely on issues of disability. He's currently at Imperial College London, where he's a senior disability advisor. He's also a researcher. Previously worked in St George's College, University College London. He's worked for the Welfare Law Society and as a disability worker in Glasgow. So he's here today to talk about his work in his new book, A Very Capitalist Condition, A History and Politics of Disability.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. I feel a little bit like somebody who's been coming to ask, let's say you were all Liverpool supporters, all right? I guess some of you might be. And let's say it was the day after a cup final where you were playing, or maybe it was just a league game where you were playing Chelsea. Like, say last year, right, when Liverpool were playing Chelsea, they were widely expected to defeat Chelsea, and of course they didn't, right? So I feel a little bit like somebody who's come to talk to you, not about either Liverpool or Chelsea, but instead about Cheltenham, you know. And that's in the context of what happened yesterday, because that seems to be what everybody else is talking about. So I feel like a little odd talking about this today, but that's just the way things go. Anyway, basically what I want to do is I want to talk about the main theme of my book, which is really about what I think is a very complex and a very modern phenomenon. And I'm going to concentrate in the book's main argument that, contrary to myth, disability is a form of discrimination and should best be understood as a form of discrimination, rather than limitations in the way that people's minds or bodies or senses work. Okay, so just to give you a good idea of my starting point, here's the first slide. Basically, the context is that we have a society that passed some of the most celebrated anti-discrimination legislation in the form of the Disability Discrimination Act 1995, which followed 5 years after the Americans with Disabilities Act. Both of these legislations have been treated as models of good practice by the United Nations, to which I shall return very shortly, and because they were seen as really excellent examples of civil rights legislation for disabled people. The irony, however, is that in both of these countries today, disabled people are stigmatised, marginalised and scapegoated to a historic degree. And in many respects, it feels like the clock has been turned back on the hard-fought rights that people, disabled people in particular, have actually won. And it's used in the language of benefit scroungers, fakers, or in Australia, bludgers for some reason. But the same language, really, that people are faking it, like the wheelchair user in Little Britain. They're really not genuine benefit claimants. And so this is a kind of language used by the media and the government to justify long-running cuts in disability entitlement and services in a climate of austerity. So that brings me to the question then, what is disability? Because for most people in the world today, most people in the global south have never heard of the term disability, or a term which approximates to the same meaning. And if you look at the vast majority of world history, the term disability is again completely unknown. And it's a concept which is very, very recent, and a concept which even those who are familiar with it probably do not take to mean that which the disability movement's meaning has fought for. In other words, a social model understanding of disability. The disability movement has fought for a very clear distinction between impairment on the one hand, as I said, limitations in the ways that people's bodies or minds or senses work, and disability on the other. In other words, the barriers that prevent people with impairments being allowed to equally participate inside a society. And the truth is that very few people understand that distinction. In fact, one researcher said that maybe 2% of the British public understood the social model or had heard of the social model of disability, despite it actually being on, believe it or not, the Prime Minister's website, the Conservative Party, Prime Minister's website, but nevertheless is something which is very, very widely misunderstood. Now, I want to try and get to some of the complexity now, and I want to look at, in particular, the issue of impairment. Basically, what I'm trying to do in my book is rescue the notion of impairment from the idea that to discuss it at all is to concede ground to the enemy, the charities, the medical model people, and so on and so forth. That, on the contrary, a proper social understanding of impairment is as important to an understanding of the social model as it has been known. And in fact, for me, it rounds out the social model in a much better way. I'll hopefully be clear what I mean by that, but in the Q&A, I'm sure you'll pull me up if it's not clear. Let me give you an example, right? Lots of you are sitting around here with specs on. Now, if I take my specs off, you're just a grey blur to me, right? With a few blue stripes and so on. I think that might be the seats. But basically, I can't really see. And I wouldn't be able to see, most importantly, to read or write, okay? Now, for that reason, that's not classed as disability. That level of visual impairment is not classed as disability. But my hearing impairment is classed as disability under the Equality Act. Why? Because in most of the circumstances in which I operate, in the working world that we live in, then that would be something that might need some form of support, some form of compensation or resources. Let me explain that a little bit more. If you were to ask me about me being disabled, I don't think you would probably want to know about my medical history. I don't think you would want to know about all the vile things that happen to me when I get ear infections or other stuff, horrible stuff that comes out my ears. What you would probably want to know is that in certain circumstances, I might not be able to hear as well as other people. If I'm in a big echo chamber of a lecture theatre, unlike this one that's much more poorly designed, I wouldn't be able to hear somebody if they asked me a question, and I wouldn't be able to hear the lecturer, which was the experience I had when I was at university. So the point, therefore, is that impairment is the individual or the private aspect, disability is the social or the public aspect. And that really is why it's so important to get an understanding of impairment on the one hand and disability on the other. In other words, the social manifestation of the limits placed on people in terms of their participation inside society. Okay, a few other things. First of all, lots of groups who are considered as disabled by other people don't consider themselves to be disabled. Lots of deaf activists, capital D deaf activists, consider deaf people to be a linguistic minority. Now, I think there's a very good cause for arguing that, but I'll come back to that later if people want to take it up. It's also true that lots of people with mental health difficulties of one sort or another, or people in mental distress, would also not see their impairment as amounting to an impairment at all, even though they're seen as being impaired or being disabled by other people. The same is also true of people who are neurodiverse, people who have got dyslexia, people who have got dyspraxia, people who have got attention deficit difficulties, people on the autism spectrum regard themselves as neurodiverse. Again, a minority, but not as people who've got an impairment, and then not as people who are disabled. So there's a difficulty already in terms of how people see themselves. Now, in what other ways is disability a distinct form of discrimination? Well, the variety and diversity of impairment is absolutely massive. Take the international symbol of disability, the wheelchair. Now, the wheelchair is absolutely ubiquitous as a symbol of disability, but in terms of representation, actually only 6 to 7% of all disabled people rely exclusively on a wheelchair to get around. So it's not actually that representative of disability. As a visual symbol, however, try and come up with something better, and you would find it quite difficult. And that's because that impairment is a very visible one. However, the vast majority of impairment is not actually visible at all. 65% of impairments are invisible to other people. So if you think of the 1 in 4 of us that's going to have a diagnosed mental health difficulty at some point in their lives, for example, or you think about people who've got all sorts of other difficulties like chronic obstructive airways disease or lung conditions of one sort or another, or epilepsy, or some of the other things that I've talked about already, such as deafness, it's not immediately obvious at all on looking at people. And therefore, if you look at the diversity of impairment, the Department of Work and Pensions and the guidance for what was disability living allowance lists 900 different forms of impairment. So you're talking about a massive category. And what's more, once you look inside these categories, you find that actually there's a huge amount of diversity as well. In other words, if you talk about dyslexia, you're actually talking about a spectrum of difficulties, not one identifiable condition. And that's absolutely true of, the autistic spectrum and a whole number of other examples you can think of as well. Or any number of lung conditions or whatever, or so-called medical conditions. Again, the same thing is often true. Okay. Now, here's the other thing that I think is quite fascinating. Probably not the right word for it. Only 25% of people who meet the legal definition of disability identify as disabled. Now, we know that because the Department of Work and Pensions did research for the Prime Minister's Strategy Unit in 2011. However, they also did the same research for Tony Blair's government in 2001. And the same research, which was done in 2001, the figure for people who met the legal definition of disability but didn't see themselves as, but saw themselves as disabled, was 48%. In other words, there was, between 2001 and 2011, a 23% drop in the proportion of disabled people who were prepared to identify as disabled. Now, if you think about my starting point and you think about what's up here, it really doesn't take a genius to work out why that is. The kind of levels of stigmatisation and discrimination and scapegoating that have taken place over that whole period, not least by the person who is now President of the United States. For those of you that remember the example when he was demonising a reporter at one of his rallies, then you can see how that might be the case. Here's another one to throw in the works. Only between 3 and 17% of disabled people are born with their impairments. Okay, so roughly 1 in 20 children in the UK are disabled, but 1 in 2 people over 65 are likely to be classed as disabled. All right, so in other words, the older you are, and the longer you go through your life course, the more chances you are of becoming disabled. So therefore, disability is something that just hasn't happened to you yet, as the disability movement says, is actually quite a useful way of putting things. Now, what's the point of going through all that stuff to begin with? My point is that the idea of a normal us and an abnormal other is something that has to be broken down and taken on, in my view, if we're going to fight for a genuine sense of what's human, never mind what's disabled in the first place. And to me, that's an absolutely vital concept if we're fighting for a world in which there is genuine equality that's worth speaking of. Then I think that we actually have to take on that kind of scapegoating and that kind of them and us mentality. All right. I'm going to whiz now through approximately 30,000 years of human history in about 5 minutes, probably less. But I'm afraid I don't have any choice if I want to try and get across an idea of the subject that makes sense and the theme of which I'm talking. If you go back to anthropology, the fact that we've now got, such things as DNA testing and so on, it means that we can look at ancient bones and we can find out how old they were, right? So in my book, there's plenty of examples of people whose bones have been found, who are thousands and thousands of years old, who've been dead for thousands and thousands of years, but they clearly had some kind of quite severe, often, spinal deformity, for example. And these were societies in which there really wasn't enough to go around, hunter-gatherer societies, where people usually lived in small bands of people. That was how the human beings lived for about 95% of the history of Homo sapiens. We know this. So for that whole period, the only way that such people could have survived would have been if other people helped support them. Now that's massively important, because if you think about the best-selling book on disability that has been so far, by a woman called, Kathleen Quarmby, who's a journalist and I think a on the board of scope. She says that in her book, which is a very depressing book, by the way, I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. It's all about disability hate crime. Anyway, basically the point of the matter is that in the book she says that she talks about the stereotypes that have surrounded disabled people since recorded history began. Now, I think that's a profoundly pessimistic, but what's more severely mistaken way of looking at the history of disabled people. But the point is that actually the historical record shows that it's actually completely wrong. If you think about, for example, how society has been characterised for the subsequent 5,000 years after hunter-gatherer societies, it would really involve people living off the land, and it involved people producing things either in or close to the family home. And the family then was a much more elastic and larger concept than the one that we know today. It largely involved extended family groups living and working, as I said, near and around the family home. And therefore, people could do things like fetching firewood, fetching water. They could maybe do sewing at home. They could maybe do some cooking or whatever. Maybe tend to the fields, tend to the animals. There were a whole series of different things that people could do. Or they could tell stories, for example. That meant that it could be included in society. That meant that they could have a role inside a society. In other words, there was a possibility for a fairly elastic, a fairly detailed and a fairly extensive division of labour in that grouping, in these groupings, which allowed people to facilitate their own involvement in society. And again, there are lots and lots of examples. I've looked, for example, at ancient Rome and ancient Greece in order to show that actually what we understand and what we are told that amounts to disability can be shown as really not being the case at all. And I've looked, there's a lot on feudal history as well, which shows that, again, this really isn't the case. Now remember, there wasn't any concept during this whole period of feudal history, before the rise of industrial society or capitalism, there wasn't any concept of literacy or intellectual ability for the vast majority of people. Everybody would take some part, as I said, in the aspect of society and the aspect of producing things. And really that remained the case until you get the rise of the towns, you get the rise of urbanisation, the rise of factories in particular. And so therefore the crucial turning point identified by people like Mike Oliver and Vic Finkelstein in the disability studies history, and they basically identified that as the crucial turning point. And the thing about this period is that these new factory towns destroyed the old ways of life. So where your life would be dictated by the harvest, by the seasons, by changes in the weather, by the week maybe, instead you get the rise of these new factories where time would be dictated by the clock and by production cycles, by the availability, in other words, of human beings to meet the requirements of the machinery. So life begins to get turned completely around in terms of people having control over production, and instead the vast majority of people having their lives dictated to by the type of production that's taking place inside society. And therefore what takes place on the back of that really, and I just want to explain the quote, sorry. Henry Ford was the inventor of motor car mass assembly production. So that was a kind of very stereotyped notion of assembly line production. And if any of you want a brilliant illustration of a Marxist concept of the alienation of labour, then watch Modern Times, the Charlie Chaplin film. Because in Modern Times, the Charlie Chaplin film, there's a brilliant section where Charlie is working on the assembly line. So imagine this is the assembly line. And Charlie's got two spanners, and he has to tighten two bolts on this unit. And he has to do it at such a pace that he keeps up with the line that keeps going along. And of course he can't keep up, so eventually he's running along like this, trying to keep up. And by the time his break comes and the factory hooter goes, he's still going like this, walking along. And that's because of what's happened to him as a consequence of being working on the assembly line. And it's a really brilliant illustration of what capitalist production does to people. And even if you think about contemporary life in terms of call centres and all the rest of it, the way in which work is regulated, atomised, broken down to its tiny tiniest unit, the way in which it is counted, the way it is enumerated, the way in which it's broken down into units of value, then again, this is an extremely important thing to understand in terms of the rise of disability as a form of discrimination. Because what happens at exactly the same time is the rise of the workhouse. The workhouse is for the undeserving poor. The special schools and the asylums are for the deserving poor. In other words, people that are incapable of work as opposed to people that are seen as unwilling to work. And in these places, the asylums, for example, are dominated by a new class of professionals originally called alienists. So the people who ran the asylums were actually known originally as alienists, which is a fascinating thing from a point of view of any Marxist, obviously. But the thing is, therefore, is that you get the rise on top of this of psychiatry, psychology, and on the back of that, industrial, clinical, educational psychology, and all the further distinctions within, and so on. And on the basis of these new disciplines, you get the increasing categorization of a whole multitude of mental health conditions, disorders, and so on. Originally imbeciles, idiots, and so on. You'll see these terms appearing right up to the beginning of the 20th century. In fact, with the 1913 legislation, notoriously in Britain. But anyway, my argument is that really it's not just the changes of industrialisation which led to people with impairments becoming segregated or marginalised, which you can easily conclude from reading Mike Oliver's account or Vic Finkelstein's account, because Vic Finkelstein in particular argues that really more technology and scientific innovation can lead to disabled people becoming more included. Unfortunately, that's not what's happened. My argument is that actually it's something much more fundamental to the capitalist mode of production itself. Okay. So really what my argument is that the Marxist concepts of alienation and wage labour are absolutely indispensable for a proper understanding of the nature of disability in our society. First of all, the loss of control of people over the productive process, over the ways in which they meet their livelihoods, in other words, their ability to survive, and the sense of powerlessness that comes from that, the fact that people have no control, are deprived of control over the productive process, something which is increasingly dictated to them and controlled by other people. And thirdly, the way in which work is absolutely subject to competition, that everybody has to compete with each other for jobs, right through society to every other concept, education, for degrees, for houses, and for a whole series of other things as well. So people with impairments become disadvantaged in two ways. First of all, their labour power is identified as more expensive to purchase for the capitalist. In other words, capitalists see disabled people as being harder to exploit. In other words, you don't get as much profit out of them. And in some respects that's true. I can come back to that later. Secondly, the labour power of disabled people costs more to reproduce. In other words, you think about the additional costs for the capitalist of employing disabled people. It involves things like ramps, changes to workstation, equipment, extra costs of travel, perhaps personal support costs, right down to much more trivial things such as maybe an adjustment in your workstation, such as a computer screen or whatever. So the point is, therefore, the needs of profit led to the rise and the creation of disability. All right, I have to say that I really, really enjoyed researching this book. And one of the things that was absolutely fascinating in researching this book was the question of eugenics. Not a very pleasant subject, as Kevin knows, I was talking to him earlier. But the thing about eugenics is that it's very much associated with Nazi Germany and the elimination of 275,000 people, disabled people, by Nazis after they had originally started sterilising them. In fact, the gas chambers were tested out on disabled people, quite literally, before the Jews followed them in far larger numbers. And the thing about this is that actually it's worth tracing it back a little bit historically, because if you look at if you look at the origins of this, it goes back to Britain itself. Now, before I go on to talk about that just a wee bit, I want to touch on the notion of normality. The notion of the norm is actually something which only appears in the English language in the 1830s and 1840s. Prior to that, it was exclusively, the norm that is, it was exclusively to do with carpentry. In fact, it's a term for a carpenter's square. And the norm gets taken up by the statistical societies which started to develop in France. And then with the Industrial Revolution, lots of British industrialists took up and founded and sponsored statistical societies. Why might they do that? I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, the obsession with categorising, breaking down units of value, of skills, of capacities, of profit, in other words. And this is something, obviously, that Marx spent most of his life analysing. But the point, as you see, is that once you get down to the question of valuing and categorising human capacities, there's quite a short-stepped hierarchy of human capacity, and therefore a hierarchy of human worth. And what eugenics literally means is the better body or the better race. That's essentially what eugenics is about. Positive eugenics is the idea that we should try and breed better people. Negative eugenics is the idea of getting rid of bad stock, as it's often called. In fact, if you actually look, you find the Department of Work and Pensions, George Monbiot found that the Department of Work and Pensions talk about benefit claimants at one point as stock, right? Human stock. And this is, this is something which, doesn't often rise to the surface, except when a Tory MP forgets what they're saying and starts talking about disabled people not being worth the minimum wage, for example, or other such statements, which I'm sure you'll remember. Or Ian Duncan Smith, when he pretends that he's not caring about disabled people all of a sudden, and other such incredible moments in history. Anyway, the point that I wanted to get back to is that if you look at the term normal and its arrival in the English language, that also coincides with the rise of the nation state and the rise of empires. One of the most interesting bits of doing the book was on deafness and sign language. And for anybody that knows anything about the subject, you will know that the Milan Congress of 1883 sounded the death knell, really, for sign language for probably millions of deaf people around the world, and explains why today many deaf people have far lower educational attainment levels than lots and lots of other people. And what happened in Milan in 1883 is that sign language was banned in schools for deaf children. And it was banned on the grounds that sign language was uncivilized, right? There's a brilliant film called Ridicule, actually. For any of you that haven't seen it, I would highly recommend it. One of the themes is about women's oppression, but the thing is that what appears in that film is an example, based on the real historical record, I think, of a priest who brings to the royal court a group of deaf people and gets them to perform and sing and do poems, things like that, and sign, and he interprets for them. And the thing about this is that this was actually what happened with the French Revolution. The French Revolution promoted the generalisation of sign language. And it was really through the French Revolution that sign language then reaches America and starts to reach much more general audience. 1883 is the year where that progress is halted. And the funny thing is, not the funny thing at all, sorry, that's entirely the wrong word. What happens in 1883, it's the same period in Italy, it's the high point of unification. What happens with the Risorgimento, as it's called in Italy, is that all the regional dialects are smashed, obliterated for a new Italian language. You might sometimes talk about estuary English or BBC English here, right? And the idea that people of Liverpool are basically uncivilised or whatever, just like people from Glasgow and so on, because we're not quite posh enough or whatever. We don't speak proper. But anyway, if you think about a much greater version of that, that's essentially what happens with with the rise of the official Italian language. What happens at exactly the same time is the scramble for Africa. And the scramble for Africa, very similarly, involved the obliteration of lots of regional and national languages in favour of the new, civilised, superior, technically and scientifically advanced European civilizations. And so this is exactly, these things parallel each other. And my argument is that it's not at all an accident that the marginalisation and scapegoating and discrimination of deaf people being institutionalised in this way occurs with the rise of empires and the rise of racism and the rise of colonialism in particular. It's part of the same process, in other words. And I think you can probably get from that my attitude towards the idea that deaf people are just a linguistic minority. Of course they're just a linguistic minority. They are a linguistic minority, but they're also a group of people who are quite clearly disabled in terms of a section of society who are scapegoated, criminalised, marginalised, and treated in many respects as inferior and less deserving of support. Just try and get a sign language interpreter for, any series of interactions at the university beyond the basic course that you're teaching, and you'll see what I mean. Okay. It's all about money. Basically, you might have found a theme by now, and that is certainly one of them. Okay. Now, this here is from the cover of the International Eugenics Congress in New York in August 1932. I could show you a number of other panels, such as the Fitter Families competitions, which took place across America during the same period, particularly the 1920s and the 1930s. This was the high point of eugenics. What stopped eugenics in its tracks was the Second World War and the fascists and the defeat of Hitler and so on, and the discovery to the world of what that had actually involved in the name of the destruction of Jewish people across Germany and much of Central Europe, and many other groups of people besides. But anyway, what the book shows is that Germany took to a logical and extreme conclusion the set of ideas which had germinated in France, been developed massively in Britain, because the first International Eugenics Conference didn't take place in New York. Do you know where it took place? It took place in London. It took place in London in the year 1912, and one of the most prominent attendees was somebody who is celebrated in British history as a great national hero. His name was Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill said that the growth of the feeble-minded classes in our society constitutes an immediate race danger. Right? That's what Winston Churchill argued. Winston Churchill and many other people, incidentally, including people who were seen as being on the left, such as the Beveridges and a whole series of other people, H.G. Wells, a whole series of other people, even Sylvia Pankhurst, believed in eugenics. And part of the reason they believed in eugenics is because, essentially, science was seen as a saviour. If you think about how science... I'll digress a second. If you read the Communist Manifesto, probably about 2/3 of it is dedicated to praising capitalism. And the reason it's dedicated to praising capitalism is because what Marx is showing is that compared with previous societies, industrial capitalism showed the potential for everybody to have more than what was needed to survive, right? That capitalism produces more than what's needed, for everybody to have a decent life, but is absolutely incapable of meeting that potential. So the point, therefore, is that actually, when you look at the capitalist society on the one hand, all the innovations in health and medicine and science and technology and all the wondrous things about the world we live in are made possible by a society that's built on blood and built on destruction and built on the elimination and marginalisation of human beings in a whole series of different ways. And disability is one of the most important components on it, I would argue. So on the one hand, you see disabled people, after the Second World War in particular, emerging out of the institutions, partly because they're seen as more expensive, and into society. And one of the things that makes that possible is, if you think about what I was talking about earlier, if you have to go and get water in a pre-industrial society, that would involve quite a lot of effort and probably quite a journey. If you had to get warm, then again that would probably involve quite a lot of effort and quite a lot of hassle. If you want to get warm or you need to get water, in our society, most of us just need to turn a tap on or press a light switch. And therefore, lots of disabled people start to be able to come into the wider society and have a degree of independence that previously wasn't possible. And that's when you get the rise, therefore, of a disability movement. People started to reject the idea that they were patients or inmates and started fighting for a notion of themselves as having rights which were being denied to them, and the way that were being patronised, and the way that they were treated as being subjects of investigation either medically or scientifically by other people, and not as subjects of history. Rejecting, in other words, the idea that they should be objects of other people's curiosity or pity, and instead the idea that really they themselves were capable and are capable of being independent actors in society and making and contributing to their own history and everybody else's. So, if you look at society, and one of the things in the Industrial Revolution that I talk about, and much more if you talk about society today, is the way in which capitalist society generates impairment. All right? I mean, even if you think about it in its contemporary sense, it's no longer about the broken back of the industrial labourer or miner or whatever. A lot of it these days is about, you go to any workplace today, one of the first things you'll hear about is the long working hours, the constant regimented sort of unthinking ability for people to consult or discuss what they're doing, and instead bullying and harassment, really based on the fact that people are working longer hours for less money and have been doing over the last 20, 30 years, and what that contributes to, in other words, in the generation of impairment, the generation of all sorts of conditions based on the fact that work and life is often really difficult and miserable for people. So the point is that society generates in all sorts of different ways impairments and epidemics of one sort or another of difficulties. And that's a double-edged thing, because we didn't know of autism 100 years ago, really. We didn't really know anything about dyslexia or ADHD until just over 100 years ago either. But the rise of a literate, numerate society meant the need to categorise for a society based on profit people that would be less profitable. So you see where the need to categorise comes from. It's not in order to get to a sense of individuality. On the contrary, it's about actually ensuring that people are categorised according to profitability. And I think that that's a really important distinction. Now here we get to the heart of the matter. Because one of the main concerns of the capitalist class is what you might call the social and economic costs of labour. I don't think that Ian Duncan Smith necessarily hates disabled people. He might do, but in a way it's not necessarily relevant. What's relevant is that he and the Tories want to cut back on the costs of the social costs of the reproduction of a labour force. And what I mean by that is that they don't want to have to spend money on benefits. They would much rather that people were in work, because it means less money for the state to dole out in terms of social services expenditure. And therefore, you have disability discrimination legislation, because they don't want too much disability discrimination. The contradiction, however, is that the employers don't want to shell out for the extra cost of employing disabled workers. And so therefore, if you look at the disability discrimination legislation that exists across the world, you can drive a coach and horses through it. Because this comes back to what the American writer Martha Russell calls free market civil rights. In other words, you can have what civil rights you can pay for. If you think about the evolution of the Equality Act since it was passed in 2010, on the one hand it looks like quite a good idea to bring together all what's called the protected characteristics or equality strands, so that racism and sexism and homophobia and all the other forms of bigotry, Islamophobia, all these other things are treated in a level playing field as equal to each other and equally able to be pursued in the courts and so on. The only problem is that the Equality and Human Rights Commission has been stripped of all its staff and resources in such a way that it's not able to enforce the law, far less even than the Disability Rights Commission was prior to the Equality Act, far less than the Commission for Racial Equality, or the other groups that monitored the way in which women's oppression wasn't ended in any way, shape, or form. So the thing, therefore, you can talk about in respect to these things is that what's interesting about both the Americans with Disabilities Act and the Equality Act in Britain as it is now is that both of them have at their heart a concept of reasonableness. In America, it's the reasonable accommodation. In Britain, it's reasonable adjustments. Now, the interesting thing is that what's determined as reasonable is founded on the issue of resources and cost. You wouldn't be surprised to hear this after what I've been saying. But the point is that what's reasonable is determined in many respects by economic factors. Okay, so if I was using the example of sign language interpreters earlier. Now, if you think about it on the level of on a level playing field, why should somebody who needs sign language interpreting have any less right to support in university, for example, than somebody who requires, say, extra time in the exam because they've got dyslexia, because it takes them longer to write or to read? There's no reason. But when it comes to resources, particularly in universities that are increasingly deprived of funding and more having to behave like businesses, then it becomes a more important matter. And what I'm worried about is that the attacks on disabled students' allowance are going to mean that more and more universities have to take on these costs themselves, and many of the universities with less resources, unlike the university I work at, are going to find it very difficult to cope. And of course, the people who are going to have a field day are the lawyers and not the people who are needing these rights in order to be able to participate in university. Okay, so what I'm not saying is that the Equality Act and these pieces of legislation are not important and don't represent progress. Of course they do. And they do in particular because disabled people conscious that they have rights and are able to fight for them. And if you're in a trade union and you're in a workplace, then you can determine what's reasonable because you have the ability to enforce it. But if you don't have the ability to enforce it as an individual, as many people who are unemployed, the 50% of people in Britain who are unemployed who are disabled, you're going to have a lot less ability to enforce these rights. And therefore I think that really is the important question when we talk about what we mean by austerity, reversing the post-war gains. Now the thing is that what we've seen in recent years is the rebirth of disability activism. When I first got involved with disability politics in the 1980s, there was no idea that people in mental distress or people with dyslexia or people on the autistic spectrum or people who were deaf were included in that movement. In fact, they were not. By and large, it was, in particular, it was bands of wheelchair users, really, that dominated the movement, often blind people. But it would certainly be people with physical impairments. It would often not include all sorts of other people. I was regarded as a lightweight, as you can imagine, because my impairments don't seem to be as disabling in many respects. But the point is that if you look at the disability movement today, then actually it's much more inclusive. In many respects, that's been enforced on us by the reality of what's going on, because when the disability movement in the 1980s formed its slogans and all the rest of it, it was about fighting for rights that didn't exist. Now, it's about trying to defend rights which are being taken away from us. And incidentally, I don't know if you can see this, but this one here is Braille. It's a Braille placard. The one up at near the top left, and it says, "We are being by the government." And I don't think you really need to guess what it says, do you? But I thought it was quite brilliant. It's one of my favourite placards on that demonstration. And really this is one of the brilliant things about it, because the Disabled People Against Cuts Coalition in Britain took the British government to the United Nations special rapporteur on human rights, and quite rightly was able to research and document and illustrate systematic violations of human rights. And the finding that was reached this week by the United Nations Committee is that the British government has indeed committed systematic and grave violations of disabled people's rights under the UN Charter. And that really is an indictment of the same government that was celebrated by the United Nations in terms of having passed disability legislation. And incidentally, the story of how that legislation got passed is well worth reading as well for anybody that thinks that that John Major's government was profoundly progressive in passing that legislation. The real story is worth discovering. I'm going to try and bring us together with a few points. If you think about the ability for disabled people to have full participation in society, my argument is that that's a class thing. That's something that has everything to do with class. Stephen J. Hawking, in his introduction to the, I think it was one of the recent United Nations documents, said that, look, I've got an army of personal assistants to help me, and they can do all sorts of things to make sure that I'm able to participate in society. But if you don't have that, the chances of you being able to equally participate in society are far, far less. So a lot of this is about what you can afford, and this is what I'm talking about in terms of rights, Rights are all about things that you're able to fight for, and I think that that's a really important question, because I think the thing about our society is that it very much promotes individualism, the idea that you yourself have to make it's you that determines your place in society and your betterment in society and all the rest of it. Individualism. So it promotes individualism, but it absolutely undermines individuality. And to me, that's a profoundly important distinction, because one of the things that Marx is associated with is the slogan, from each according to their ability and to each according to their need. Now, if you think about that, and you read the passage that actually leads to it, which I quote in the book at length, you will see that Marx didn't actually talk much about equality, and he wasn't that interested in equality as people understand it. He was much more interested in the question of difference, all right? Because I'm going to show you one of my favourite cartoons here. This quote is attributed to Albert Einstein. I don't know if Einstein actually said it, all right? But the quote, sorry if you can't see it, everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will spend the rest of its life thinking that it is stupid. Now, if you take away the surreal aspects of that, I think you can see, what it's getting at. Because the cartoon shows you all these different animals lined up in front of this guy who's telling them they've got to take an exam, and they're all going to be treated equally because everybody has to do the same exam. Everybody has to climb the tree. Whether you're a goldfish or a seal or a chimpanzee, you've got to climb the tree. So that's fair, isn't it? And of course it's not fair, because equality, absolutely contrary to all the mythological reactionary nonsense, is not about treating everybody the same. It's not about us all going about in grey overalls like something out in 1984. It is about celebrating and fighting for a sense of true diversity and human potential, and building a society which liberates, which unleashes the potential of human beings to build a society, to build a humanity which is worth fighting for. And actually that is why, the much of what Marx is associated with when his sense of talking about the beginning of history is that humanity is in the process of overcoming our society in which we live, is in the process of becoming, right? And I think that's a brilliant way of thinking about it. That the true history of human beings is only going to begin when we get rid of a society that shoves square pegs into round holes, that makes us conform all the time, at the same time as it celebrates a notion of individualism, at the same time as it tells us that we ourselves can all, arbeid maakt vrij, work makes you free, and what it actually does, it enslaves us, it deprives us of genuine control over our lives. Now, I haven't been able to talk much about mental health, so what I do want to do is I want to give you a quote from somebody who writes about these things in a much better way than I can, by a guy called Peter Beresford, who's a mental health service user and also a columnist and writer. And he says the following: While people always say that what they want most in the world is peace, what characterises it constantly are war and conflict. While in recent years mental health service users or survivors have come under growing attack for being threatening and dangerous, for their association with homicides, ours is a world that in other contexts celebrates the military, has exhibitions of its killing machines, and at particular times expects men to carry out orders to kill in war unless they can offer convincing, conscientious objection to doing so. The manufacture of weapons is one of the greatest polluters of the environment, yet we focus instead for a greener future on campaigns against the use of plastic shopping bags. Now, for me, that sums it up quite beautifully. It really does. You know, the sense of what the kind of world we need to live in is not going to come about by paying 5 pence for your plastic shopping bag at the supermarket. It's going to come about through completely challenging and undermining and transforming the social order in which we live. And only by doing so, in my view, are we going to have equal rights that are worthy of the name and equality and liberation that's worthy of fighting for. I'll leave it there.